Hi, everyone. Welcome to the third day of the Afghanistan Symposium 20 years later. We are so grateful and thankful for all of you who have joined us in these last couple of days. If you've missed any of the sessions, they are up on our YouTube channel. You can search for MESC UCR and you'll see our channel there and subscribe to it. And you can see the keynotes and panels from the last few days, as well as other events that we've done. So once again, my name is Omar Aziz. I am the director for the Middle Eastern Student Center at the University of California, Riverside, located in Southern California. We are doing this in collaboration with the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies Department at UC Riverside. So we are grateful for their co-sponsorship and support in this work. Please make sure that you are following us on social media and using the hashtags to engage with this symposium and leave any comments, feedback that you may have. So you can find us at MESCUCR for any social media, on Twitter, on Instagram. Use the hashtag AFG Symposium or hashtag UCRAFG, and that will hopefully generate some other posts and feedback and comments that are coming across Twitter and Instagram that you can look at. So the first 2 days of our symposium we started with history of Afghanistan and sort of what has led us to the U.S. occupation in 2001. On Tuesday, we talked about the culture and the media and looking at how culture and media has shaped Afghanistan and in particular the last 20 years and how the occupation influenced the way folks are consuming media and how Afghans are being represented in the media in the last 20 years since the start of the US occupation. So we encourage you all to check out our keynotes and our panel discussions from the last 2 days if you haven't had a chance to do so. And for today's keynote, we are so lucky to have Azmat Khan join us. However, we did have some travel issues. Azmat Khan is actually in Afghanistan and speaking to us from Afghanistan. So we, unfortunately, for those who may be familiar, flights and traveling are kind of sometimes can be very last minute and not always predictable. So we weren't able to get her live, but we are so lucky to have still have her join us in a conversation that we pre-recorded with one of our panelists from tonight, Dr. Nura Sediqe. So I am going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Nura Sediqe, who will be interviewing Azmat. So Nura Sediqe is a postdoctoral research fellow and lecturer at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. She's also an assistant professor in political science at Michigan State University. Her major research endeavor involves Muslims in the United States and how a faith-based community with transnational linkages with political contexts like Afghanistan reconcile their prior social contexts with the current American political climate. And our keynote today, Azmat Khan from Columbia University. Azmat Khan is an award-winning investigative journalist, a New York Times Magazine contributing writer, a Carnegie Fellow, and an assistant professor of journalism at Columbia University. She is writing a book for Random House investigating America's air wars. Her investigations for the New York Times Magazine, the PBS series Frontline, and BuzzFeed's investigations team have exposed major myths of the war, prompting widespread policy impact from Washington to Kabul and winning nearly a dozen awards. So today's conversation is going to be focused around the impacts of the occupation, and we'll really narrow in on the last 20 years and how the people of Afghanistan have been impacted and what's been the outcome of these last 20 years as we're heading into the anniversary tomorrow. So we encourage you all to tune in and listen to this wonderful conversation with Dr. Sediqe and Professor Khan, and we are so excited to have you all here join us. We are also going to share the link to our crowdfunding campaign to sponsor 2 scholars to come to UC Riverside and continue their education and scholarship here. So as you look through and watch this video, please make sure that you are also contributing to this incredible effort to bring scholars to UC Riverside. So without further ado, I will go ahead and pass it on to have you enjoy and listen to this conversation between Nura Sediqe and Azmat Khan. Thank you.
Hello and good afternoon. I'm really excited to have this opportunity to be joined with Azmat Khan. And Azmat, before we begin, I just want to sincerely thank you for the work that you're doing. Afghanistan is fading from the news cycle, and you've been one of the few reporters that has not only been reporting now and been on the front lines, but you've been in this space for years. And in a lot of ways, that consistency and the voice you're giving to the experiences of Afghan people, it's not something that a lot of journalists dedicate time to. So I sincerely want to thank you for the work that you've done, as and the fact that you're not letting this shy away from the news. So thank you so much for joining us and lending your time and expertise on this conversation.
It's my pleasure to be here. I love the lineup of speakers. I love what you guys have planned. And in all honesty, I love that there's such an active audience who wants to learn about this and hear about this and be involved. So thank you for having me.
We're really excited to really get your sense of the impacts of the occupation. And I wanted to start really just, this is the 20th year anniversary of 9/11, and this conflict emerged soon thereafter, now in October, right? So can you share a little bit about the beginnings of the US occupation and what happened after September 11th that began all of this?
Right. That's a great question, because it's so easy to look back now and think we could have done so many things differently. But it's really hard to underestimate the climate after 9/11, which was so powerful. And so many, I think, brown people in the United States, so many Muslim Americans, so many people of color experienced what that was like and can attest to the sort of climate in which this was the first time the US homeland was attacked in this grand spectacle. And there was such a desire and thirst for US retaliation, for action to hold those who were accountable. And at the time, Osama bin Laden had been in Afghanistan. And something that's really interesting to know back then is that the United States wanted bin Laden, approached the Taliban to get him, and they rejected that offer. But over time, it's like bombing threat became closer and closer. Mullah Omar apparently did dispatch deputies to go meet, a CIA officer, Robert Grenier, and offer a kind of surrender that would allow him to save some face, a surrender of bin Laden to a third party country, some kind of a Muslim country, rather than directly to the United States, for example, Qatar, an offer that was made both before the bombing and during it. And the United States rejected it. And so there actually was an opportunity early on, not just to halt sort of the extent of this war, but also to prevent it in the first place. Like these were conditions on the table, but I think that given the sort of appetite and that climate in the United States at the time, there really wasn't a lot of political will for that kind of diplomacy. And you saw that materialize as the war unfolded, right? There was very little appetite for surrender. Members of the Taliban were surrendering themselves, asking for amnesty. And many of them at the Bonn conference and others, they wanted to be integrated, and yet that didn't happen. And so you saw the war kind of proceed in this trajectory in which very quickly there was this massive bombing campaign, and the Taliban fell fairly quickly. And in that wake, as the United States started to envision what happens next, there was this desire to start nation building and to really build a new government after the regime had fallen.
So what you're saying is this political will really informed that there was that moment to mitigate and stop the human carnage that we see unfold, but our own landscape in the US guided it so that that just wasn't a possibility. Interesting.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah.
And so is that the point that you see that the situation went wrong? Like what started to go wrong, like in our presence, in the American presence there? Was it just simply the fact that we missed this diplomatic opportunity to resolve the issue at hand? Or what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think some of the earliest missteps obviously involved, at least Afghanistan watchers, people who are very close to it, cite some of these issues. But I think on the ground, where you started to see, what was an effort to change this landscape and change this space, where it went wrong is that if you get really local in certain parts of the country, if you go to Kandahar, Helmand, Uruzgan, what was happening was that American soldiers, the US mantra after 9/11 was like, the gloves are off. They were there to hunt Al Qaeda and the Taliban, and they were really aggressive about it. And that meant that they were offering incentives on the ground in order for people to turn in those who may have any involvement in this. And what actually wound up happening is that people informed on their rivals, people motivated by profit, essentially, were turning in people. You had an instance in which there were the United States, they entered with not that many troops to begin with. So who did they partner with? They started partnering with local warlords. And this is where you kind of have to rewind and look back to the 70s and this, the Mujahideen era, which you had seen them fighting the Russians. And when that war was over, right, people who had been funded from all of these different countries, weapons had been supplied. That war ends, right? The Russians leave, and you see the government crumble, and now all of a sudden there's civil war, there's chaos, and a lot of warlords emerged back then.
Right.
People who were so corrupt that they were responsible for why the Taliban came to power in the first place back in the 90s, right? The United States, when it entered and needed allies, who did they work with? Some of those very same warlords, right? And they engaged in really abusive human rights practices. They engaged in massive corruption, and they really took advantage of that profit model. And I think that's, at the heart of what the earliest missteps are. And, I can say this because, I've done on the ground reporting in some of these places, especially most recently in Kandahar. And then also back in 2015, I spent a lot of time looking at this, and the number of times that the United States allied itself with a really corrupt local a really corrupt local leader. It happened in every district, in every place. And, just as an example, what wound up happening in this one village that I've been going to was that a very senior, and this is in the South, it's in a place called Bande Timor, a very senior a very senior local elder who partnered himself with the government, who's working with this new Afghan government, found himself raided in the middle of the night because somebody had tipped them off, the Americans, that this man might be a terrorist. Yeah. So they come into his home, they arrest him, they kill him, they wind up, several others are hurt in this battle, they arrest a few others, and this entire village turned Taliban. They weren't before that. This happened repeatedly. So I think those are at the heart of where the American project then started to create a class of not just warlords, right, but different kinds of power brokers. Some of them were politicians, some of them were drug lords, some of them were contractors who were, business entrepreneurs, people who started their own logistics companies and went from, having like pennies overnight to millions.
Right. And that's I think, so there's two things you mentioned I want to pause because I think they're very powerful. That what you said was one, you mentioned that this village, they didn't really, they didn't have an anti-US persuasion, but it was this violent action that happened that then they became pro-Taliban, right? And so you saw that trend emerge, right? And then second,
true. Yeah.
Is that true? So you're seeing that sort of in different villages where, and he was killed immediately. That elder?
He was killed in the altercation. Yeah, I don't know. It's he died there, and then actually what happened was that people heard. So Americans had landed in helicopters to come to this compound. His name was Haji Burgate Khan, And they land there, and there's some great reporting on this. But they land there, and oftentimes when you come in guns blazing into any household, people often fire back, right? They don't know who's entering their house in the middle of the night. And it could have been a circumstance like that. Right. So, but he wound up dying. His son wound up dying. One of his other sons was maimed. And then 50 people, at least 50 people, were then arrested and taken to Kandahar Airfield. This was in 2002. And these were pro-government leaders. That night, as people were being rounded up, people in the village could hear this. They started to leave their homes to see what was happening. And when they arrived and showed up, they were then arrested, right? And then people would go see to where their family members had gone, right? And had not returned. They were then arrested. And that's how you got 55 people, 50 to 55 people who were taken to this airbase, stripped naked, actually, and put in a cage. You know, I've met people who were, this happened to them. And so protests actually broke out at the time in Kandahar city, and they asked for these people to be released, and they eventually were released. But the indignities of it stayed. And this was one night raid, but there were two others that happened that same year, within the span of a year, for people who had allied themselves with the government, were accused of something, and many believe by one of their rivals. This is a big poppy production area. And by taking out a leader like that of a particular area, you now have access to their lands, right? You have access to their agriculture. So, you know, this was happening all of the time, where somebody would accuse somebody else of involvement with the Taliban or Al-Qaeda. And that was a great way to suddenly take over that land or get the police contracts and have your locals be the police force in this area and get paid. It happened repeatedly.
That's like the disheartening piece, is like that reality. And then, so you mentioned then the power brokers. So people were vying to be in these positions of influence because of the financial incentives and other incentives it offered, right?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, look at people who accumulated extraordinary amounts of wealth over this time. There is very little dispute, right, about some people who've built not just mansions, right, but who have been able to buy properties in Dubai and elsewhere, or WikiLeaks cables that say particular leaders came in, you know, the State Department cables that say that, you know, a particular leader was caught coming into Dubai with $52 million in cash in an airplane coming from Afghanistan. This was happening. That amount of corruption was really entrenched in that counterterrorism goal, that like the gloves are off approach. And it was a really toxic mix, I think, for civilians in some of these places that became, you know, rife, especially the rural countryside, rife for accusations and false imprisonment and deaths.
So these are some of those, like, I think what's important for me is like these are the consequences that people don't think about. Is there are layers and dimensions to how layer one is simply the violence that's inflicted on the communities, and the second layer are the reverberations of what you're saying, that it changed the ecosystem, and then the corruption elevates, and now this counterterrorism strategy is incentivizing people to sort of turn to to take these actions, and it's building. And in so a lot of ways, is this replicating what was done in the 90s, or how does the U.S. counterterrorism strategy and the post 9/11 invasion look different than the involvement they had earlier in the conflict?
No, you're absolutely right. They empowered a class of warlords that originally back in the 90s, if you look back at the actual event in the 90s that led to the rise of the Taliban, here's what happened. Actually, there were a series of checkpoint commanders in Kandahar who had, and there were many warlords, this was around the country that this was happening, where these roving militias set up checkpoints and charged locals lots of money to pass them, kidnapped women, you know, abused people. There were a lot of profit incentives, and actually 2 women disappeared at a checkpoint that was commandeered by a man named Saleh, a local warlord. And those women disappeared, and this man, who was a scholar, a Muslim scholar in the local community in Sangaisar, basically felt like enough was enough, and he called out to the community, gathered some others. I think there was like a group of around 30 people that started to do outreach, and they decided that they were going to take on Saleh at this checkpoint. And that's actually the checkpoint not not far from it is where they found the bodies of the women. And
Wow.
people were so riled up. They had been murdered and before that raped, right? And they were so riled up about it that this scholar, this cleric, had been like, come join me. His name was Mullah Omar, and within 2 years of that, they had taken Kabul. Like, that is how powerful that corruption was in the rise of the Taliban. So now if you go back to 2001, 2002, the Taliban had been defeated, right? They were not staging attacks. They had been really crushed in that bombing campaign. Many of them returned home. And for a few years, it was, this war seemed in many ways to some to be on the right track. And yet at the same time, I know in July of 2002, there was an airstrike on a wedding convoy. There were a lot of these in Uruzgan province in a place called Kakarak that killed at least 40 civilians. There were these major incidents that, I gave one example with Haji Burgat Khan, but there was a Haji Nusra, like in the village next door, House of Mungal, 2 villages down. People started to hear this, and that really led to the resurgence, or it led to the Taliban coming back from the dead. By 2007, you saw it, right? For a few years, you'd seen this progress, this building. And at some point, you started to see in parts of the South, in parts of the Pashtun countryside, you started to see the Taliban gain local support and reemerge.
So there was an opportunity then in 2002 for the US to have changed strategy, but they continue. So this counterterrorism strategy, like, I guess that's what I'm curious about, is they remain on a specific course and they don't modify, in terms of the level of violence, and no matter how strategic, the lives of civilians are still being lost. So in a lot of ways, you're saying that's what's contributed to their rise again, is like they had these opportunities that they did not take advantage of to retreat. And why is that? Is it again because of the public appetite? Can you say more about why the US was so persistent about remaining?
Right. So look, the United States was hunting for bin Laden, right? Here's this man that they'd wanted, they didn't have. And imagine if you're there and you're meant to be in this place hunting down Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and somebody comes to you and says, look, I know, they partnered with you, and they say, look, I know that this man is staging attacks again. Okay, one of the other things that frequently happened, and there's a great Nation cover story called How the US Funds the Taliban that gets into this, but it was documented by so many reporters. The reporting was really good for a number of years investigating this, but basically that in some cases, people who were allied with the United States would actually explode particular places where there were American bases, or threaten particular projects and stage attacks that then made the United States hire them to do local security. Like this, these are the kinds of things that were happening. And the United States wound up in that case, right? You're now funding these different groups, or you're paying for security or whatever it might be. But there were people who were staging attacks simply because there was such a profit incentive. Remember, the United States, it didn't start out nation building, but at some point it started injecting massive amounts of money, especially as the Taliban reemerged. They started to want to win hearts and minds. And in doing so, they were massive contracts. I've looked into a lot of these, particularly around schools. But the United States they want it, and it's a wonderful thing, right? You have such high instances of maternal mortality in Afghanistan. The healthcare access was so low. You should be building clinics, right? You should be building schools, right? In a country where women and girls had been so prevented from an education. These things sound so noble and important. And certainly in urban centers, you saw those thrive. But in a lot of rural areas where there was space for people to take advantage of that system and to profit off of it, what you wound up seeing were individuals who pilfered the money from these contracts, people who staged attacks on them in an effort to get money. And then you saw local leaders too, who diverted contracts to their family members under the guise of security and who I can trust. But even in documents I've obtained, in many of these cases, the Americans knew that, but they had to look the other way at that corruption because that was their man on the ground. That was their partner in the fight against terrorism.
So what this really makes me think then is an important part you're mentioning about the nation building is that this arc of the 20 years. Does it feel like there were two parallel realities in the sense of an experience that Afghans in urban arenas had versus rural? Because that's sort of one of the things I'm getting based on your accounts is there's different types in some. So did folks in urban areas almost have an incentive to be more pro-US or just more amenable to some of the consequences of the war because it affected them differently? Like how
Yeah,
did they
yeah, I want to be careful. I don't want to say it's strictly in urban areas, everyone
right.
profited, in rural areas, people didn't, but there is some truth to the reality that in a lot of urban centers, you saw that money flow in and you saw the changes that were made for the great benefit. This war benefited many people
Yes.
in urban centers, right? Imagine not just like, I've spoken to people who, young women who've told me that, they were able to have women in Kabul who've told me they got to have lives and careers their parents could never dream of, their mothers could never dream of, people who became actresses and musicians.
Yeah.
And there was incredible progress, like in Kabul in particular. And certainly in some rural areas, you also saw a lot of progress. They were not battlefields in particular parts of it. We can name some of these provinces that have seen a lot of, peace, and maybe they didn't see the same economic opportunity as an urban center might, but they still saw at least, in terms of openness in society and different kinds of benefits. But in battlefield areas, in rural countryside that were places where I would say probably about 30% of the country is where a majority of the violence over the last 20 years has happened. In those areas, what you found was actually the complete opposite. So in the village that I've been sampling for the last 3 or so weeks, and I go every day, house to house, to as many places as I can, every single family has a story of at least 4 deaths in their family. In these places that I've been looking at, everybody has stories of not just airstrikes, but these night raids by police forces, by CIA-backed forces, and then these airstrikes. And their experience of this war, they never saw in the village that I'm talking about. There is not a single school in that village. It's called Barang. It's a village in Bande Timor. There's not a single school that's been built in that village. There is also not a health clinic or hospital or even a doctor in that village. And I've been asking people, well, what do you do when you get sick? And you have 2 options. You can go to, a man with medicine. He sells it in this village and he's not a doctor or pharmacist. Or you can take a 2.5-3 hour journey by car to Kandahar city to get treated at a hospital.
That's
and
the closest.
They told me that a week ago, a boy who was sick, he made that journey and died halfway on the way there. And so these are places that it's not just that they're dying, right? It's that they never saw that promise. They never saw that progress. In 2015, I did an investigation into US funded schools in Afghanistan, right? This thing that is arguably one of the greatest legacies of this war has been education. And that's the case, in urban centers. But I did samples of 50 US funded schools and 7 battlefield provinces in these rural areas and found that, 10% of them were either non-existent or had never been built, that a vast majority of them were falling apart. And then when I dug into why, I would hear story after story of some corrupt local actor taking the money for that school. And you saw really devastating consequences on the ground.
So they're just acquiring contracts, but not fulfilling the promise to build what the US, what they committed to.
I'll give you an example. Like I walked into a school that was supposed to be built in a village called Debar. And I get there and it's unfinished, but in the records I had, this was a military school. The records I had said it had been completed. There'd been a ribbon cutting ceremony, and yet it wasn't completed. It was, the construction materials were strewn about. There was no boundary wall around it like there was supposed to be. And I kind of ask around in the village and everyone's like, oh, the kids study at the mosque down the street. So I go to the mosque and there's about 50 children spilled out onto the lawn of it. And I start to ask questions and they start telling me, yeah, well, there was this contract. It went to the district governor's brother. He took the money, the person he took the money from didn't let the school open then. So yeah, these kids study here and the girls, they don't get a regular education. They only get a religious education. There was a man with a stick walking around. And when I asked him about it, he's like, oh yeah, it just, it helps, I just do this. And a little kid literally said, if there is no beating, there is no learning. Like this was the impact of one $100,000 contract in something that had been promised. And I saw it over and over, in which, in another case, it was literally one of the warlords, his brother, who was responsible in the 90s in that checkpoint, that chain of checkpoints in Kandahar, from the rural parts of Kandahar up to the Lashkar Durai, up to the Kandahar city, those checkpoints. It was one of his brothers who was responsible, who was allied with Saleh, the commander I mentioned, who wound up getting the contract. And I saw that over and over and over in something as noble as school building.
And I think what's powerful is specifically what you said, is that in some ways, as a consumer of these stories, we just think like perhaps this is isolated, but we're telling us this is like a trend you've seen across your time and investigation there. And I think, and so what does that make you think in terms of thinking about the lasting remnants of the consequences of the last 20 years? Is like, it's in the education arena and the fact that these things are not being fulfilled. Are there other arenas that you see some of the negative consequences from this emerge that people I honestly don't, I think like it misses mainstream public discourse in a way that we don't pay attention to?
We've seen this materialize in a lot of reconstruction and a lot of nation building. I was thinking about it recently in the context of just, the Taliban are not really popular, by the way. They're not really well liked. It's just that in some cases they were the less, in an instance in which people felt that their government didn't represent them, that there were people who were really benefiting from this and at their expense. In this village, people tell me these harrowing stories of night raids in which the former police chief of Kandahar, Abdul Razak Achakzai, would, send his forces and they would arrest people. And if you were arrested and you were innocent, you would still get imprisoned and you would get charged like 2 lakh rupees, like around like more than $2,000 to get released. And people couldn't afford that in this village. So even if you were innocent, you get arrested, you get charged. And it was a great money-making endeavor for him. And so what wound up happening is that when these night raids happened, because the Taliban did operate in this area, when these night raids happened, the men would come running from their houses, right? Some would get on motorcycles because they couldn't afford the fee that the police forces took. So what wound up happening is when they started running, they would get seen by helicopters and airplanes. And a large number of the people who died in this village died in airstrikes as they were fleeing because they could not afford the price of getting arrested by Abdul Razak's forces. Like these stories we didn't hear. I couldn't get access to this village until now, by the way. It was way too dangerous to operate. In 2019, I was trying to, because that was the year that the United States dropped more bombs in Afghanistan than any previous year. It was
In any
previous year, and yet it got the least amount of media coverage in 2019.
And so I emphasize it because that's shocking, even as someone who thinks they're connected, to realize that in 2019, this is the reality. Is like you think it's wrapping up, but there's this escalation.
Well, I think they escalated in an effort to wrap up in 2019. The goal was let's get the Taliban into a weak negotiating stance by really escalate. But in 2018 and 2017, you still saw an uptick. So 2018 had not as high as 2019, but it was still record levels. And if you read, the Afghanistan papers by Craig Whitlock, you can really see the ways in which the United States had for quite a while known that they'd lost this war, right? That was an understanding that really was certain or imprinted into many Americans' minds by 2014 during that withdrawal. And yet they wanted to sustain this, some people have called it mowing the lawn, right? Which is just doing just enough to support this tenuous hold that the Afghan government had in these parts of the country that it really had no local support in. And the way the United States did that was that they provided Afghan forces, who died in large numbers, by the way, in this fight.
How
The
many?
Afghan National Army. So we don't know the exact numbers, but the Brown, Institute for the Study of the Costs of War estimated, I think, around 60,000 Afghan forces had died fighting. Others say it's even higher than that. But the problem is the numbers on the ANA are not good. It was part of the inflated. And I think the United States also did not want some of those numbers there was a transparency issue, but we do know that they did die in large numbers. And even they were dying in large numbers, even with US air support. The way that American airstrikes worked is that Afghan forces would be out on the ground and Americans would bomb, in an effort to protect them if the Taliban were in the area or if they were getting fired upon. And so, it's really, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but when we talk about, why the Taliban came to power or why the Afghan army crumbled so quickly, imagine that this air support is the only thing really sustaining that Afghan government hold in many parts of the country. And when you take away it or you reduce it, right, you're now going to suffer even higher losses, the Afghan army is, right? Who would continue that fight knowing that it's certain death? That and the fact that those airstrikes did result in a lot of civilian deaths in the rural south, in Nangarhar and Kunar in the east, especially when the air war against ISIS intensified, or ISIS-K intensified. What wound up happening is that also created support for the Taliban. Some of its latest recruits in the last few years were people who lost, family members in that escalated bombing. And so you take away that air support, you're now not only, going to have many in the Afghan National Army not continue that fight because it's certain death, it's a very understandable feeling, but also because now there's even more support for the Taliban in those moments too, because of the civilian costs of those airstrikes. It's a bizarre paradox.
Thank you for that. I wanted to mention also, so as we're talking about the US, there's also, the reality is Afghanistan is a landlocked nation. And so the neighboring countries come up and sort of like how much they've been involved. And something you hear a lot amongst the Afghan diaspora is as fingers being pointed to Pakistan and the Pakistani government. So I was curious and as much as has come up in those types of conversations and diaspora scenes, what you can say about Pakistan's involvement, and then also other regional actors, because they're not the only one. But I think the biggest focus, at least amongst diaspora, has been Pakistan.
Yeah. So, Pakistan will often get, confronted with these, claims of, you're playing a double game, and their response is, no, we're not, we haven't done X, Y, or Z. And that's a lie, right? Like Pakistan has certainly played a role in this war. That is undeniable. You can see it early on with the sort of hosting of the Quetta Shura, the fact that, senior Taliban leadership did have this haven in Pakistan to come to, right? You can see it in the fact that, they often, they'll say they had no role. That's a myth. At the same time, you will hear Afghan leaders and, others who will say that Pakistan was the reason, right, that the Taliban had this resurgence. If you look at that leaked transcript between President Ashraf Ghani and President Biden in the month before the fall of Kabul, Ashraf Ghani says on the phone, "Sir, we are facing a full-scale invasion from the Pakistanis. They're here. They're fighting us." And it was in an effort to get more air support that he said this, right? Mm-hmm. It's often used as this means to really say that this is like a foreign invasion, that the Taliban's resurgence can be traced only to Pakistan. But the reality is that it's a little bit more complicated. Right. And it's really between these two extremes that you can see it. In that village that I just have been sampling, they don't have death certificates in that village. So I go to graves to check. And in a particular place, I literally stumbled into a graveyard of Pakistanis who'd come to Afghanistan to fight. Oh. Their tombstones said Karachi, Haripur, Hangu. Yes, Pakistanis did come. There were maybe about 24, less than 50 graves in this graveyard that were specifically of Pakistanis. So we know that fighters had come. We know that the Pakistanis had hosted senior leadership, but I think, it's also important to just look back at what even has been said on the record. And I just want to read a passage from the Afghanistan papers, in which, it's apparently something that's recounted by former Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who is recalling something that Pakistan's former intelligence chief, the ISI head, Ashfaq Pervez Kayani, had said. And here's literally what was recounted in this interview. I know you think we're hedging our bets. You're right. We are, because one day you'll be gone. He's talking to the Americans. It'll be like Afghanistan the first time when the United States turned away from Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal in 1989. You'll be done with us, but we're still going to be here because we can't actually move the country. And the last thing we want with all of our other problems is to have turned the Taliban into a mortal enemy. So yes, we're hedging our bets. And if that interview is true, right, you literally have a Pakistani army chief on the record saying, yeah, we're hedging our bets, we're playing both sides. But he's saying he's doing so because one day the Americans will be gone. And that day is now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And they're still stuck as, like you said, neighbors and border negotiations and a host of other things. And I think that there's my father's family is from Herat, and so in a lot of ways this comes into sort of who's connected to the realities. And the reality is they're a Farsi Dari speaking community, so the Taliban seem like outsiders purely because of other differences. And so you can see that message is persuasive to some because they just think of some folks as others, and are able to lump folks together in a way because of physical distance and other distinctions, right? But the reality is that the truth lies in between these two polar arenas of talk that we're hearing, right? What about other regional actors? Are there other regional actors that you think have played a role that we haven't paid attention to? Or I mean, everyone, like you said, there are neighboring countries that have to deal with Afghanistan for purely practical reasons. What has that conversation looked like? What are those realities like?
Right. I mean, I know that we can look at the foreign forces that have come here. We can look at neighboring countries that have played different kinds of roles and militant actors. But I think that so much of this is, to be really honest, it's that US apparatus that injected vast amount, that really changed the structure that we talked about. And it's also an economic climate. Like, I don't mean to get off track from the occupation and the war, but there's a reason that for the last many years that so many Afghans have been trying to leave the country or make their way to Europe.
Yes.
And smuggling themselves through Iran. And I just recently spent a lot of time interviewing these young boys from Herat, from a really rural village in Herat, who, they were forced to work by their families at a very young age, at the age of 11, 12, whatever it might be. And they smuggled themselves into Iran. They have harrowing stories. One of them, their cousin died. They found him drowned in a tank. They thought he just drowned. And, when they got the body back, like his some of his organs had been removed, right? And these were like young, vulnerable boys. They were at like a deportation center. They had gone to Iran to work, had been deported. And so when we talk about this, it's not just the carnage of, the violence. It is also the fact that there's such instability. There's a lack of economic opportunity. People in some of these places have not seen the gains that we've seen in other areas, right? And they were trying so hard to leave, making their way to Iran, where it's really difficult as well, right? You're illegal. If you're there, you can be deported at any time. And, you can try to go on to Europe, and chances are that you might pass away along the journey, or there may be incredible hardships along the way. So I think that it's not just when we think about regional actors and what's happening, we also have to think more about also just what it means to be somebody who's trying to, an Afghan who's trying to leave and going through these other countries on that route, and just the reasons for why they're leaving, and then what it's like to be a part of that journey as well.
Absolutely. And I think that's the most compelling part of this is that um, for having family in Herat, I did not, the desire to leave only happened within the last few years. And so what you're recounting is, it really like raises the hairs on my back. So I'm like, this is exactly it. There's low economic opportunity and people feel like there's no future here anymore and it's for basic survival. And so you see like a different type of cost. While folks in Herat may not have been on the front lines of some of the casualties, there's a different kind of cost they're paying that they're like, we may no longer pay this. But then again, when they do leave, they are actually physically giving up their lives because the risk of, so folks know these risks exist. It's part of the conversation, yet they're still willing to take that risk. And there's a reason for that. It's like, how bad must it be for you to do that? And from that sense, in terms of the civilian, the human cost, I know you're doing a lot of work now, just really documenting the civilian casualties and the impacts on this ground. And I'm very curious if you could share more about what the human toll of the war, which we've been discussing, but your current project to me is really, I'm really deeply fascinated about what you've been finding right now.
Yeah, so like I mentioned, so this is the first time I've been able to go to some of these places that I've been in. So in Bandi Timor, this area, I've been in like Barang, Joman, it borders along Helmand and into this desert like area. And so I couldn't have dreamed of getting there before. It would have been far too unsafe, but I also wouldn't have been allowed to. And so basically, in about 3 weeks time, I've learned what it would have taken me a year to learn,
Wow.
sitting in people's homes and not just cataloging things like death, but understanding, how this community is structured and how they operate. And, what I've learned about the human toll is that, people and they've died for other reasons. Yesterday, I think I'm trying to remember if it was yesterday or the day before yesterday, I was in Lashkargah. Not Lashkargah, Grishk in Helmand province, and sitting with a family who, this woman's husband had just been assassinated by the Taliban. He was a scholar at a mosque, and the mosque was in Grishk district center or near one of Grishk areas where a lot of the bodies that came into that mosque to be washed and cleaned were actually government body, like a, Afghan politician, Afghan police, people like that.
Right.
Even though her husband was pro-Taliban, even though her husband's brothers were in the Taliban, even though that her son was Taliban, her husband was still assassinated, right? Her father was assassinated by the Afghan government. They've lost people on all different sides, right? Like the Taliban is not some, cohesive force. There are people who are still carrying out killings within them, right? Amongst others who are deeply entrenched or close to the Taliban. The Afghan government was killing large numbers of her other family members. And just imagine what it's like. I don't want to paint this as though it's only deaths from US airstrikes. The Taliban have extracted heavy civilian losses as well, right? In many of these areas. I will say that one thing I've learned is that I really look skeptically now at the UN numbers that for years told us that more civilians were dying from the Taliban than were dying from Afghan and US forces and partner forces. And I say that because the likelihood of deaths being reported to the government or to the United Nations or to anybody who would be doing this counting is really low. So for example, in the village that I've been going to, none of these deaths they didn't even get death certificates in this village, right? They didn't have any closeness to the government to be able to say, like, here's how many people have died in these airstrikes. And the numbers are much higher than what's officially been documented. So I have a lot of skepticism that we truly knew the true civilian toll of this war. I think that we're now, as people have more access to places, we'll start to see things that never got documented because these people were so far removed and had no incentive. They didn't feel, represented by this government to come to them and say, hi, I would even just like to register that my child died. That was not something we did.
So there's an underreporting almost in terms of, so it's worse than where we're really thinking about in terms of the carnage that we've left behind in the last 20 years from all of this. That's a that's a very sobering reality to reconcile, but I think it's an important one because um, we, yeah, there's a way that we think about it's hard to, like in some ways it's like what was worse. We want to, in some ways, like my human condition wants me to sort of see things in a much more categorically neat boxes, and there's so many dynamics and nuances to how these casualties have happened that we have to think about and consider. And so for that person that you interviewed, where was their mind at the fact that they faced losses from both the Taliban and the Afghan forces? And is it something they even think about in that way? Is it simply that they're just beleaguered by war and they don't have an opinion? Is they just where was her mind at with that?
So fascinating and extraordinary, because she would tell me these stories with kind of she was like, look, my life now, if you don't have a husband, and she's 10 children,
Mm-hmm.
if you don't have a husband, you really can't do a lot of things here. My life is over. I'm so depressed. These things have happened. But she would say it with a laugh, and she would also show me, and I would ask her about that. I was like, why are you? And she's like, honestly, this is the only way that I can feel strong, is if I talk about this and I smile, or if I show you that I'm strong, I'll be stronger. And she was showing me these amazing clothes she makes. She sells clothes, tailors. Anyway, she's this extraordinary woman and she did say something to me, and I'm really not doing her justice right now, but she said something to me like, look, this is what it's been my whole life. Like, this has been a cycle of this. We're all going to die someday, and I am too. And I just have to accept that and do the best I can with what I have. I think that it depends on who you're talking to and where you are. But I know that in Barang, the village that I've been in for quite a while, that people there are like, oh, the war is finally over. We're quite pleased about that. We're not dying in night raids, and they call them WEGO incidents. They're not dying in these WEGO incidents and these airstrikes. But they're really worried about the economic climate. A lot of them are farmers. Lots of crops, the prices have gone down, the borders have closed. They can't grow a lot of things. People have been talking about actually like the opium crops have not been good for several years now. There's like a yellow disease on them, they keep telling me. So they're planting like wheat and corn instead, and really are not making ends meet and are really worried about their futures. So even in places where there has been some kind of a positive change, people are really scared about what's ahead with the economic crisis, the freezing of this money. The Afghan government doesn't have its salaries. They're not able to pay people. What really happens with this looming food crisis, this economic climate where people can't take out money from the bank, where there's an extreme cash shortage. So despite the positive impacts of this war ending, there are still, even in these places where the war has been devastating, there's still a lot of problems ahead. And if I may, I think it's important to also give voice to, certain minority communities that were incredibly persecuted under the Taliban, and also really had incredible gains, in the last 20 years. I think I would be doing an injustice if I didn't mention Hazaras or others who now are at great risk, and, who have multifaceted experiences with this war. I think it's important to acknowledge that, there are many people now, and so many women in urban centers who stand to lose everything they've ever worked for. And that is an incredible cost.
So that's exactly where my mind went, is when you're talking about this, is like, what happens now, and what are the concerns now? And so with the Hazara specifically, what or do you think, so there are, can you share a little more about the progress they've made and what's at risk for them specifically? Because like you said, they've always been on the margins, and so in this way they're in the margins of our discourse, but they're amongst the most targeted in these situations, and historically have been, as you've mentioned. And so, and then even religious minority groups, because Hazaras are predominantly Shia, right? So are other Afghan Shia targeted? Because in Herat, for example, and so my entry point with you in this conversation is purely from a personal point of view. And so I know that the Shia community in Herat are, they've been the ones that, at least in families that I know, that have been forced to sort of like been targeted to assist the Taliban. And if they said no in terms of just cooking, right? Like they're being asked to cook and they're not being given funds, that's when they're face violence, right? So it's like interesting to see who is being asked to assist or being demanded of things from, right? So I'm curious about what that looks like, because I think that's a really important point that you have a lens into that we may, folks tuning in may not have an understanding of.
Yeah, no, I mean, you just made so many excellent points. And yes, they have been systematically targeted in many major attacks, Hazara neighborhoods. We've seen that. I also think a lot, not even just about the Taliban, but about ISIS KP and who they would be most likely to target, right, in this new Afghanistan. And I think that we don't really quite know yet the toll, who, I certainly don't. I have to be honest here, I don't know
Right.
who will be the first. Right now, things are so fluid. I've been safe here, things, that I'm a foreign journalist, it's a different story, but we don't know what the relationships are. Even there've been, different kinds of disagreements, even amongst the Taliban leadership, right? There is, as the economic climate worsens, right, you might see more resistance and you might see this government really, this current moment of, I can't predict what will happen is what I'm saying, is that I just think it's such a certain, it's this moment in time where, I don't know what will happen to different communities. I just know that there's a track record, right, in which they've been targeted in the past.
Yeah.
Where they've faced disproportionate amounts of violence. And based on that, I think we have some insight into what might happen.
Thank you so much. So as we wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to thank you for your time and see if there's any final conclusions or thoughts you wanted to leave the audience with to think about as we think about the impacts of the war of the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think that it's, seeing some of the news that has been coming out, reporters who've been able to get to some of these areas we haven't heard from is so important. But at the same time, I'm not Afghan. I can't understand what some of the costs are for people who truly live here and have to face this. And I think it's really important to focus on getting some of those voices and stories out and hearing from them, because I think that I've been learning so much just even in the month that I've been here on the ground that I didn't know before. And I think that I guess I would conclude with, we have the capacity to be surprised now in terms of the information that might come out from some of the places we haven't heard from. And I hope that people will follow and will continue to follow. I know that the Afghan diaspora will of course follow this war, but I think it was a great tragedy that for the last 5-6 years, this war has dropped off the radar. And the way, despite continuing at record pace. So, I would say that's really, I'm thinking a great deal about what it really means to understand or follow a war or a place where, a country like the United States has been involved and then has just up and left, right? To understand what that legacy really is. We can have this conversation now, but we still don't know the full effects of what this has been and how it will continue to play out for years to come.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being one of the reasons that this has remained on our radar the last 5 to 6 years. This is the type, in so many ways, like documentation, and you've kept this conversation going. And one of the biggest fears that Afghans have is this fading. And so we will be linking your Twitter handle and your articles for folks who have not read your work yet. I think that you've done some of the best investigative reporting to offer the rich details and context to where the conflict has been and where it's going. So hopefully, I definitely know I'll stay tuned to your reporting. And I thank you for your time and commitment to making sure that the most marginalized voices are uplifted here.
I appreciate it. It was lovely talking to you.